Here's your report.
Oh, thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire someone just like you.
Try LinkedIn Hiring Pro. It's more than a job board. It's like the recruiter you always wished you had. Hiring Pro uses real-time insights to match your role to LinkedIn's unique network of professionals and delivers a short list of best fit candidates. You'll spend less time sorting applicants and more time talking to the right people.
Let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
In 1962, 62 workers at a textile factory in Tennessee became ill with dizziness, nausea, and a strange feeling of numbness. They all blamed a bug. There was no bug. There never was. And somehow that's the most unsettling part.
You're listening to Unbound, off script. No outlines, no safety nets, just Beth Curry talking about whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell you've asked her to uncover. It's unfiltered, it's unpredictable, and it's officially started. Pull up a chair and don't expect her to stop talking anytime soon. She's a total blabbermouth. Take it away, Beth.
Hi, you're listening to Unbound. This is an off-script episode. I'm Beth. Today, I want to talk about one of my favorite categories of human experience, which I say with genuine affection and also a certain amount of existential dread. The moments when large groups of people share a vivid, overwhelming, real-seeming experience of something that isn't there. This is mass hysteria. This is collective delusion, psychogenic illness, whatever you want to call it. The phenomenon has been documented across centuries, cultures, every demographic you can imagine, educated, uneducated, urban, rural, children, adults, skeptics, believers. It does not discriminate at all. It shows up in medieval convents and 21st century schools. It shows up during wartime, during peacetime. It shows up in factories and in hospitals and small towns and on social media. And every single time it shows up, the people involved are completely and utterly, absolutely convinced that what they are experiencing is real. Which, given everything we talked about in the Reality Tunnels episode, should perhaps not surprise us as much as it does, but it does. It always does. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning here, which in this case is a party. And the party's the wrong kind. Strasbourg, July 1518. Anybody there? Were you there? I don't know. A woman named Frau Trophia steps into the street and begins to dance. This is not remarkable on its own. Well, maybe it was back in 1518. I don't know. I wasn't there. Except that she dances without stopping for days. Days, guys, without music, without any apparent reason, without rest. By the end of the first week, she's been joined by approximately 30 other people. And by the end of the month, the number is closer to 400. That dancing continues for weeks. People danced until their feet bled, and people danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. People died from strokes and heart attacks, sheer physical depletion, things that didn't even have a name way back then. The city authorities, under advice from the local physicians who diagnosed the ailment as a, quote, hot blood condition requiring more dancing to resolve it, which is the kind of medical advice that looks really bad in retrospect, actually hired musicians and built a dam stage to accommodate these dancers. So this is what is now called the dancing plague of 1518. Have you ever heard of it? It's one of the most extensively documented cases of mass hysteria in history. It has been studied by historians, physicians, and social scientists for centuries, and the consensus explanation is psychogenic illness, a mass conversion disorder triggered by extreme psychological stress in a population that was, at the time, suffering from famine and disease and widespread economic hardship, and kind of channeled through a culturally specific belief system that included a tradition of Saint Vitus's curse, a religious affliction that manifested as compulsive movement. Historian John Waller, who has written the most thorough modern account of the dancing plague, emphasizes two things that make it a useful lens on mass hysteria broadly. So first, the suffering was real. Okay, these people were not performing or faking. Their bodies were in actual physical distress, producing these symptoms that were as physiologically genuine as any illness, even though no pathogen was present. And second, the cultural container was essential. So the dancing plague didn't happen everywhere all at the same time. It happened in Strasbourg in this very specific historical moment among a specific population with specific beliefs and specific stressors. The form of the hysteria was kind of shaped entirely by its cultural context, which is a pattern that will repeat essentially unchanged for the next 500 years. Okay? So the dancing plague is spectacular, but it's far from unique. The historical record of collective psychogenic illness in religious communities alone could fill several books, and in some cases it fills extremely uncomfortable chapters in the history of how institutions respond to things that they can't explain. In the 15th and 16th century, a series of epidemics of bizarre behavior kind of swept through convents across Europe. In one of the more bewildering cases, a nun in a French convent began meowing like a cat. Same, fam. Within a short time, the other nuns were also meowing. Every day, at a particular hour, the entire convent would erupt in collective meowing that lasted for several hours until soldiers were stationed outside the walls and threatened to flog the next nun who meowed. This stopped the meowing. In another case, documented by physician Johann Weyer in 1563, nuns at a German convent began biting each other. Oh, these nuns. And then biting nuns at convents in other regions, and this epidemic of biting eventually spread across multiple institutions in multiple countries. These accounts were, for a long-ass time, interpreted through the lens of demonic possession, which was the culturally dominant explanatory framework for inexplicable group behavior at the time, right? So what's notable from a modern perspective is that the behavior itself tracks almost perfectly with what we now understand about mass psychogenic illness. A trigger event, so usually a person exhibiting symptoms, spread through social contagion within a tightly knit community under significant stress, with symptoms that conform to the cultural expectations of the community about what inexplicable illness looks like. You following? The nuns in those convents were under enormous psychological pressure. There's social isolation and rigid institutional control, suppression of individual expression, and in many cases, involuntary placement in religious life that they had not chosen. So the meowing and the biting were not random, right? They were the specific shape that psychological distress took inside of that specific container, okay? So I'm going to skip forward now about 4 centuries, because this isn't just about, historical phenomenon, and because the 20th and 21st centuries have given us cases that are kind of even more useful for understanding the entire mechanism. So June 1962, cold open, you heard it, small town in the American South, textile factory, one worker. She complained of nausea and dizziness and said she felt something bite her. And shortly after, a colleague complained of the same symptoms, and then another and another. And over the following days, 62 workers were affected. They reported all the same symptoms, as well as the sensation of being bitten by something, and several of them were hospitalized. Now, the factory was evacuated, obviously, and public health officials and inspectors from the U.S. Public Health Service and entomologists from various agencies kind of descended on the plant. Obviously, they tested the air, the fabric, the water supply, the ventilation system. They searched every inch of the building for insects, and they found nothing. There was no unusual chemical levels. There was no pathogen. There was no insect capable of causing the described symptoms. After a thorough investigation, a team of sociologists, Melvin Kirchhoff and Kurt Bach, whose subsequent analysis of the case became kind of a landmark in the study of mass psychogenic illness, concluded that what had happened was a textbook example of hysterical contagion. So the workplace was under significant stress at the time, right? Workers were anxious about overtime demands, and there was interpersonal conflict. There was an existing culture of complaint about working conditions. And the first workers' symptoms, whatever their origin, provided the spark, right? Social contagion, the spread of a belief and its associated physical symptoms through a group, did the rest of the job. And what makes this case kind of useful is the pattern of who got sick. So Kirchhoff and Beck found that the illness spread along social network lines. So women who were friends or frequent companions of an affected person were more likely to become affected themselves. Women who were socially isolated were less likely to be affected, even if they worked in the same space. The bug didn't spread the illness, the social network did. So psychologists and physicians now have a reasonably good understanding of the mechanism underlying mass psychogenic illness, even if the specifics can kind of vary, right? The core process involves what's called psychogenic symptoms. These are real, genuine physical symptoms produced by psychological processes rather than by an actual pathogen or a toxin or a physiological injury, right? This is not the same as faking. The symptoms are real and the nausea is real and the dizziness is real. And in some cases of conversion disorder, that's the most extreme form of this, people develop paralysis or blindness or seizures with no underlying neurological cause. Like it's wild. The brain produces these symptoms as surely as it would produce them in response to a physical cause, because the brain doesn't really make a clean distinction between the categories the way we would like it to. So the spreading mechanism is social contagion. It's a process closely related to what social psychologists call emotional contagion and what neuroscientists attribute in part to the mirror neuron system. So humans are profoundly wired to synchronize with each other emotionally and physiologically. And when you observe someone in pain, your own pain processing circuits kind of fire up, right? So when you observe someone anxious, your own anxiety circuits activate a little bit. It's not like a flaw in our design. It's more the basis of like empathy and social bonding and cooperative behavior, right? It's enormously useful. It really is. It also means that in the right conditions, a physical symptom can spread through a group the way a cold spreads through a household, right? So the conditions that make a group vulnerable to this process are pretty consistent across cases spanning 5 centuries. So they are a pre-existing high-stress environment, a trigger event, like usually one person displaying symptoms. Then there's a cultural framework that provides a plausible explanation for the symptoms, like a bug or a curse or a toxin or a demonic presence, whatever fits the local belief system, whatever. Then social transmission through established relationship networks and an amplification loop, in which like institutional responses like investigations and hospitalizations and public announcements confirm and deepen the sense that something real and external is causing all of these symptoms. So the last factor is critical and counterintuitive, okay? Official investigations and responses that take the external cause seriously, which is the responsible thing to do since you don't know at first, that there's no external cause and you don't know what you're dealing with. It can actually accelerate the spread because they provide external validation for the belief that something is wrong. So this creates a genuinely difficult problem for public health officials who have to take potential environmental or biological causes seriously while also being aware that their response can itself be part of the contagion mechanism. The clinical term now most widely used is mass psychogenic illness, or MPI, through older terms including mass sociogenic illness and epidemic hysteria are still used in literature. Okay, so hysteria is a term, it's kind of fallen somewhat out of clinical favor due to its historical use as a gendered diagnosis. And it's worth noting that, yes, historically, both the diagnosis and the literature have been heavily skewed towards female patients, which reflects both genuine data, like MPIs do appear somewhat more frequently in female-dominated environments, like the nuns, schools, convents, factories, all that, and historical bias in which what gets documented and labeled as hysteria versus taken seriously as a real physical complaint. That was a really long run-on sentence, but I had to get that thought out because I was going to lose it. Anyway, I hope it made sense. If you think this is ancient history or something that happens only in isolated communities, I've got some news for you. In 2011, a cluster of high school girls in Leroy, New York began developing involuntary muscle tics and verbal outbursts resembling Tourette's syndrome. Within months, 12 students, all girls, were affected, along with one adult woman and one boy. So the case, it received enormous national media attention. I don't know if any of you listening heard about it. I did. I remember it. Neurologists and environmental health experts and anti-fracking activists all got involved, each with their own theory, right? The school district was investigated for environmental contamination, conversion disorder, as I said, the current clinical term for what was historically called hysteria, was eventually identified as the likely diagnosis for most cases following workups that found no environmental cause and no neurological pathology. The conclusion was not well received by the families, which is entirely understandable. There's a history of people being gaslit and just not taken seriously and all that kind of stuff. And being told that your child's involuntary tics are psychogenic, that they're produced by the mind rather than a physical cause, feels probably to most people like being told it's made up, but it isn't. Conversion disorder is a real diagnosis with a growing scientific literature and increasingly understood neural mechanisms. But the cultural stigma around psychological explanations is so strong that families often reject these diagnoses, even in the face of comprehensive clinical evidence. Okay? So neurologist Laszlo Mechtler, one of the physicians who evaluated many of the Leroy students, noted that symptoms were highly responsive to cognitive behavioral therapy and stress reduction, which is consistent with the psychogenic etiology, right? And that most of the affected students improved significantly following that treatment. The social contagion element was also supported by the spread pattern, which tracked social media connections among the students. Now, social media, by the way, is now recognized as a significant accelerant of mass psychogenic illness. I've always said social media is an absolute cesspool. What it first kind of produced for people was good, but it's just gone absolutely downhill. The traditional model required physical proximity. You had to be in the same room as the affected person to kind of catch the social contagion. But social media removes that requirement. The tick epidemic of 2020 and 2021, in which thousands of adolescents globally, predominantly girls, developed sudden onset tic disorders that bore the distinctive features of functional tic-like behaviors rather than Tourette's syndrome. And it's maybe the most dramatic illustration of this new dynamic involving social media. Researchers at multiple institutions, including a prominent paper from specialists at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, and another one from the Movement Disorder Society, concluded that the tic epidemic was driven by mass social media exposure to content featuring young people with tics, combined with the extraordinary stressors of the pandemic period. The symptoms were, again, real. The tics were genuine, involuntary movements, but they were functionally produced and socially transmitted, and in many cases remitted when patients reduced their exposure to tic-related content. The platform's new. The mechanism is ancient. I would be remiss in a 2026 conversation about collective mysterious illness, not to mention the ongoing and genuinely contested question of Havana syndrome. So in 2016 and 2017, U.S. diplomatic personnel stationed in Havana, Cuba, began reporting a strange cluster of symptoms: headaches, dizziness, unusual auditory sensations, cognitive difficulties, and neurological impairment. Now, similar reports subsequently emerged from U.S. personnel in China, Russia, and elsewhere, and the phenomenon was labeled Havana syndrome, and it generated years of investigation and significant political concern and multiple government inquiries. So multiple theories were proposed, including sonic weapons, microwave-directed energy weapons, and acoustic devices. Significant resources were invested in investigations by the CIA and the State Department and the intelligence community. So in 2023, a comprehensive assessment by multiple intelligence agencies concluded, with varying degrees of confidence across agencies, that Havana syndrome was very unlikely to have been caused by a foreign adversary using a weapon or a device, and that the symptoms were most consistent with pre-existing conditions, environmental factors, and in some cases, you guessed it, psychogenic illness. This conclusion was predictably, and just like in New York, deeply unpopular with many of the affected personnel. Some of them organized and pushed back forcefully, and the scientific and political debate continues to this day. I'm not going to tell you definitively what happened in Havana because I don't think it's settled and I don't know. But I do think the case is a useful illustration of how genuinely difficult it is in individual cases and in real time, without the benefit of historical hindsight, to distinguish between mass psychogenic illness and a genuine external threat, and of how politically charged that diagnostic question can become. Everything's political. It's terrible. The honest answer in this case, as in others, might be some of both in different proportions in different cases. I don't know, right? So what I find the most interesting philosophically, every case of mass psychogenic illness is a demonstration of something that we know intellectually but resist emotionally. And that's that our experience of reality is not a direct readout of what's objectively present in the world, right? It's like a construction built partly from external sensory input and partly from internal expectations and beliefs and emotions and the relentless social pressure of consensus. So when you're in a room where everyone is experiencing something, like when everyone's dizzy, say, when everyone can smell the chemical and when everyone is scratching at the bite, I don't know, your brain receives that social information as strongly as it receives sensory information. And in some conditions, it weighs it more heavily. So the consensus of the group becomes part of your reality construction input and not just a belief you hold abstractly. Now, I've talked about this guy in previous episodes as well. Solomon Asch showed this in his line experiments. People will deny their own sensory perception when the group contradicts it. Leon Festinger showed it in his studies of cognitive dissonance when reality conflicts with deeply held beliefs held in social context, and the social reality is often more durable than the external one. And the phenomenon of mass psychogenic illness is essentially Asch's experiment played out at like this full biological intensity, with the body itself producing symptoms in confirmation of the group's experience, right? This is not a pathology of weak-minded people. It's like an expression of one of the brain's deepest features. It's radical dependence on social context for constructing reality, right? For most of human history, this feature was like enormously adaptive. You live in a small group and the group notices something dangerous and you kind of catch the group's alarm response and you mobilize before you've personally seen the danger. This is a good system. It keeps you alive, right? But the shadow side of the system is that it can mobilize in response to threats that don't even exist when the social conditions are right. And the social conditions that make it more likely, like stress or tight-knit communities or these cultural frameworks that provide a ready explanation for suffering, institutional responses that amplify the signal, these are not historical curiosities, right? They're present in various forms and in every social environment that humans create. So, mass psychogenic illness makes people deeply uncomfortable because it seems to kind of imply something unflattering about the people affected, like that they're weak or credulous or unstable, whatever. It's important to be direct. This is not what it implies at all. The people affected by that dancing plague that I started the show with were not uniquely susceptible compared to us, right? And the workers in Tennessee, they weren't unusually gullible, and the high school girls in Leroy were not making it up. They were all human beings, and being human means having a brain that's built to use social reality as a source of information about the world, because for most of our evolutionary history and social reality and physical reality pointed kind of in the same direction. And when they diverge under specific and unusual conditions, the results can be pretty dramatic, right? The most, sobering thing that I can offer you as I wrap this up, you probably believe right now with full subjective certainty that if you were in one of those situations, you would be among the unaffected. You would see through it. You would trust your own perceptions. The historical and experimental record suggests otherwise. So, get off your high horse. The conditions have to be right. And the conditions are never as unusual as we would like to think that they are. Which doesn't mean that you should start doubting your own senses about everything either. It means that you should be curious about the social environments that you're in and the stress levels that they operate at and, the consensus reality that they're constructing and the gaps between what you individually perceive and what the group is telling you to experience, okay? Because that gap, like when you see it, it's one of the more interesting places to stand. Believe me. That's it for this episode. If you want to reach out, join the Facebook group, email me, help support the production costs of the show, whatever. All the information's in the show notes, and I will see you next time.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Unbound Off Script. Someone eventually had to pull the plug because, as you know, Beth will happily keep talking until the sun goes down. Thanks for listening, and we will see you whenever she finally runs out of things to say. I'm Rob, she's a blabbermouth, and we're out.